Hey, you've probably noticed it is indeed February, which means we need to wrap up January reading. I mean, we don't need to do anything, but I would like to wrap up January reading with you. So if that sounds good to you too, I am very grateful. Hang tight and we will dive right in. For those of you who maybe are new, I'm Melody, and on this channel, I talk about books. Now, while I do talk about books, we didn't sit down and discuss any overarching goals for the year in terms of my reading life, mostly because I don't want to disappoint myself. I did set my reading goal at kind of like a baseline 100 books, which is what I have been doing for the last couple of years. Now, full disclosure, I used to shoot way past that, but in the last 5-ish years, basically since my work has become a little bit more mentally demanding, I have had to scale that back. So 100 is a comfortable goal in that mentally I know I should surpass it. And I've talked before about the fact that I can set that goal to whatever I want, but mentally I'm still going to be kind of gauging myself against what I historically know I've been able to read. And to be clear, I'm not gonna rehash a lot of the kind of arguments that are almost kind of snowbally in some ways that we've had regarding reading too much or not reading enough, and just kind of the contentiousness there. For me, it's not about the number. It is about, as I've said before, the never-ending TBR and all of the stories that I want to consume and all of the nonfiction I want to consume as well. So that's where we're starting as a baseline this year. And that being said, January was very successful because I read 15 books. Now, I have been in a kind of audiobook groove over the last, well, it's almost a month and a half, which is great for me because that means I can slip more reading in and get to more stories and also chip away at the backlog of Libro.fm books I have hoarded away in combination with all of the audiobooks I have on hold at the library. But that is definitely helping me get through more, which is amazing because especially with romance, I tend to gravitate to things like romance and nonfiction on audio because it's just easier for my brain to process those for some reason. Mileage may vary, but I've been very much enjoying my mileage lately because the last year or so, kind of broad swathy, I haven't been able to focus on audiobooks as much as I would like. So no judgment to myself, I am allowed to listen to the alt control playlist while walking around the city instead of listening to an audiobook, but it's nice when I find that groove again. And in that vein, I did indeed start the month with an audiobook, Sure I'll Join Your Cult by Maria Bamford, which I was very excited about. And you may have heard me talking about it last year in an anticipated reads video. And I was let down by it. So I went in expecting this to be kind of adjacent to, you may know, I am very interested in anti-MLM kind of explorations and books, which we are getting at least one more this year, and something else kind of adjacent. So I may do a video down the line about some of those kind of adjacent books. But in that vein, kind of more your lightweight cults, things from the book Cultish by Amanda Montell. I'm of course fascinated with the really overt cults and those explorations as well, but just the idea of how people fall into these groups, and especially how things escalate gradually, sometimes less gradually in a really concerning way. So was very excited about this going in because I thought it was going to be this kind of exploration, a comedic look, which I also love comedy on audio, which also falls under the nonfiction umbrella. But I definitely think if you're trying to get into audiobooks, comedy is one of the best entry points in terms of building up that kind of muscle in terms of listening to audiobooks. However, so I expected this to be a kind of comedic look at cultthink and the kind of personality type that is attracted to this. And again, going back to the ideas in Cultish, this idea that you're not ever too smart to fall into a cult, right? So everything was lined up for this to be the perfect book for me. And it started out promising with Bamford retelling the time that she was pulled in for the Scientology survey of sorts and how she escaped that. And that was about as cultish as it ever felt. It did kind of toe the line of exploring things like AA as a cult, but not in a way that ever really grappled with that in an interesting way. And instead, it more looked at her kind of dysfunctional family dynamic. And the comedy was not it for me. It felt very flat. It felt very mean at times. And it really was reliant on things that maybe would have been funny to me like 20 years ago, or funny in the public consciousness like 20 years ago. But in terms of being so disappointed by how this book was packaged and marketed, in terms of really leaning into that interest in cults from, I think, a lot of people, and instead getting a really kind of self-indulgent memoir. And sure, by default, memoirs are somewhat self-indulgent, but there still has to be that angle there that is of interest to others. And in some ways that goes back to the humor too, because the book kept going back to this idea of how hard it is to write a book, and is she gonna have to pay back her advance, in a way that as a reader, I don't want to hear about that. And it also goes back to, I think, the Amy Poehler book, which had a couple of similar jokes. So this doesn't feel like it has evolved past that. It made it very evident that this was kind of pitched on concept, and it also only made it clear how much it floundered in the execution of that concept. And part of it may be that I do not have any familiarity with Bamford's work outside of this book, but this isn't making me interested in it. So the TLDR is, if you are going into this for the cult angle, you are probably going to be disappointed, because I was. And then we have The Devil and the Heiress by Harper St. George, which is a Gilded Age romance that I talked about in my video about romances to read after the Buccaneers. And it follows an American heiress, Violet, who, in attempting to escape a marriage with a British peer arranged by her parents that she does not want, particularly because this peer has made it abundantly clear that he has no qualms in compromising her to get what he wants, she finds herself compromised by someone she thought was a potential ally. In some ways, this is kind of reminiscent to me in terms of structure of something like Devil in Winter, or maybe like It Happened One Autumn leading up to Devil in Winter, though we deviate there because our romance is between Violet and Christian, but Christian has been very interested in Violet. So why he goes to these kind of villainous lengths to secure this match is kind of partly due to finances and needing of finances. But when Violet discovers what is actually happening, it is going to impact the feelings that are already budding there. So this is part of the Gilded Age Heiresses series. It is the sequel or follow-up to The Heiress Gets a Duke. You don't necessarily have to read them together. However, Violet is the sister of the heroine from the first book, and her romance is kind of seated in that book. I do need to finish this series because I bought the fourth one just out and about. Was it Romance Bookstore Day? I don't remember it exactly. Last year, I think it was Romance Bookstore Day. It doesn't matter, but I still need to read 3 and 4 to finish up the series. It was a solid romance. It kind of floundered a little bit in the second half for me, but I still really enjoyed myself. Then I read The New Naturals by Gabriel Bump, which follows a couple of Black academics who, after the devastating loss of a child, start to disassociate from real life and start chasing this idea of building a utopia, especially the wife in this couple. And so they end up building this utopia in the bowels of an abandoned restaurant in this countryside. And that is incredibly interesting because the idea of utopias and separate communities and the kind of cult adjacentness of that, whether it will bleed and turn into a cult or whether we can achieve a pure utopia, a real utopia, is incredibly interesting. And this, at least in the blurb and what I read around it, really leaned into that idea of exploring the utopia and the utopia being at the center of the story. However, in reading it, the utopia is not the center. It's the center in that it is the thing people are chasing, but rather this book felt to me like a Canterbury Tales of the broken, the beaten, and the damned. We end up following a myriad of other characters who are going through really hard things in their life or are battling demons of some kind, and how their stories lead them to or close to this utopia. And then on the other side, we do still peek in with this couple and see where the utopia is starting to kind of flounder. We see the mysterious benefactor that is behind the funding of this utopia and what that means, but we're seeing everything from a kind of slant. We're not firmly in the middle of it, which may also be a commentary on seeing utopias realized and the odds of seeing utopias realized, but it was definitely a much different approach than I went in expecting, and it was very heavy, especially at the beginning. And while the story is kind of coming at things slantwise, the narrative and the language language also feels like there is a little bit of opaqueness there. Now, at the same time, I think the language is really what saved this for me, especially because a couple of the characters that we're following who are in Chicago, so that was an interesting kind of angle as well, felt very Waiting for Godot adjacent to me. And if you know me personally, you probably know, or I have confessed to you in some vein, that I actually really dislike Waiting for Godot, which feels blasphemous as a theater student, and I recognize it is succeeding in what it sets out to do by evoking such an intense emotional reaction, but that's how I feel about it. And now that I think about it through that lens, maybe this book is more Godot in some ways as well. But that being said, when I mention that the language is a little bit more opaque, I don't mean it's inaccessible. The prose is really poetic and beautiful here. There is a specificity to the language, but it's just very interesting to think about what this book was setting out to say, what it was setting out to accomplish, what it wanted to do. And in some ways, I don't know if it succeeded because I don't know if I can pin down what it was aiming to do. It wasn't my favorite. Admittedly, I didn't love it as much as I wanted to going in, but it was still incredibly compelling, and it is a very quick read, but it is a very heavy read at the same time, is the caveat there. Speaking of very heavy reads, I'm going to need to read this title out, but next I listened to A Fever in the Heartland, The Ku Klux Klan's Plot to Take Over America and the Woman Who Stopped Them by Timothy Egan. This was nominated on the Goodreads Choice Awards last year, and in some ways I really regret not having this on my radar more last year, because while I do not regret what I voted for in its category, I definitely think this would have been a contender. I think this was my favorite book that I read in January. And while I have been sitting with this since I finished the audiobook, I don't know that I've still collected all of my thoughts about it. I want to talk about it particularly more with people that I grew up with and around, because it is so rooted in Indiana history. I mean, it is Indiana history, and the history that is often left unsaid. This is not what you're going to hear about in Indiana history in fourth grade. I mean, to be fair, it's not really fourth grade material appropriate. However, there is a lot of refusal to acknowledge the racist history of the state, especially in small communities. I don't say this with any malice, and I have a great love of where I grew up and the people especially that I was surrounded by, but I also have personally been faced, especially since college, with the realities of a lot of this racism that is not specifically understood. It is a lot more subtle and has been kind of co-opted under this idea of history when it's not seen for the history it is. And this book acknowledges and lays bare that history in a way that if we can talk about it, we can talk through it. This is the history my grandparents were born into. And I do acknowledge that that connection probably played a role in my enjoyment of the book, because I had a sense of the geography in this book in a way that I often don't, because I am geographically challenged, I acknowledge that. But this book mentions places I have lived, places my brother has lived, places I have been visiting my whole life. And to be fair, there are also places referenced that I have no conception of. And before I dive more into some of the literary workings and potential criticisms I have, I do want to read this from what I wrote after finishing, just because I think it encapsulates a little bit more what I've been trying to say here. I say things not mentioned in Indiana history but seem to permeate unsaid. The end of this book is the history my grandparents were born into, and so much of the rhetoric mirrors the contemporary in eerie and disconcerting ways. And of course, Indiana is caught up in it again. I think many Hoosiers would benefit from reading this, not because this is our only history, but because to never speak it allows it to repeat. And so I think that's the case. Now, in terms of the book itself, I like that we build this kind of broad swath to start with. We're really setting the scene for how much of a grip Stevenson had before we look at his downfall through Madge. However, I think in some ways Stevenson does steal the centralness of the narrative in terms of exploring that power, which I understand setting the scene, and we attempt to give Madge some of her story back. We discuss who she was as a person to some extent. We talk about her. I believe she was a Butler student. That is a very real thing that I can contextualize as someone that had many friends that went to Butler. However, it's also hard because it's impossible to completely divorce Madge from the really awful, violent assault that was the impetus for Stevenson's fall. So violence against women is really central here and is explored somewhat explicitly in this book in a way that you may want to avoid if you think that is going to be hard for you, because it really is upsetting. It's supposed to be upsetting, to be fair, and I don't think it's approached in a way that is gratuitous to the point of exploitation. It is really setting the scene for this downfall and just exactly what he thought he could get away with, and the knowledge that this probably isn't that removed from what has happened to a lot of people from then to now, unfortunately, and just what people in power think that they can do and what they have the right to do, and how Madge persevered through this. I think there is an attempt at the end of the book, especially to circle back, tighten it back up by recentering Madge in this and giving her her due in some ways, but then we also widen it back out to be like, but all of the hate wasn't just because of this one person. It wasn't one person that was causing an entire state to be hateful. Rather, it was a man exploiting the hatred that already existed for personal benefit. And what does that mean? So there is a lot to unpack here. I would argue if you were a Hoosier or not, especially because Indiana has been used as Middletown in some ways, which is referenced in the book, especially when it's talking about Muncie. But yeah, I just have so many thoughts here. And again, I am not saying that all of the history and all of the people of Indiana are corrupted by this history, but I think it is impossible to not see it in a lot of ways. And I think especially the way that Indiana has been presenting on the national stage in the last however many years, as a former Hoosier, it's concerning to me. So I will leave it at that, but I had a lot of thoughts and feelings about this book. And then I read The Jen Waits 100 Years by Shubnam Khan, which I talked about in a Feature Friday, so I will try not to dwell too much on this, especially as I just went on an entire tangent with the last book. But this is following a adolescent girl and her father who have moved to this old manor that has been turned into essentially apartments after the death of her mother and the loss they have both been feeling. And in the process, she starts to kind of stir up the history and the memories of this house, which lead us back to a historical timeline and a kind of tragic love story that balances out what we are experiencing in the present. It also has some speculative magical elements, especially in relation to our adolescent protagonist. You might be saying melody. Jen is right in the title. That's magical, and yes, you would be correct. However, the Jen starts to feel, at least feels for me, a lot more metaphorical for much of the novel. It's not as active a presence as I anticipated, even as the blurb mentions that he's just kind of watching, or the Jen is just kind of watching what is going on, and this is stirring up memories. However, at the same time, especially in relation to the Jen and that kind of magical air, there is some really beautiful writing in here in terms of like the things that you glimpse just out of the corner of your eye. And I love how successful that is. That idea of like, oh, was it the curtains just billowing, or was there someone there? And not even in a like jump scare kind of way, but in this way that just leaves you a little unsettled. And it's just really striking and beautiful and hard to pull off. So I really commend Khan for executing that so seamlessly. This is a much slower novel. It's distant in some ways, especially in relation to the historical timeline and that being retold as kind of a story. And this idea of story is there. There's also an eccentric ensemble of adults that are significantly older than our protagonist that all have something broken in some way. And so it really is about that brokenness and that healing and moving past these traumas in whatever way, and how we have to tell the thing to move past it. So very interesting. If you're looking for a very atmospheric, kind of slow simmer of a novel, this may be for you. And then I got my hands on Ghost Roast by Shani Gibbs and Chanel Gibbs and illustrated by Emily Cannon, because I clicked that handy little notify me button on Libby, so I got first dibs at this graphic novel when it was purchased by my library and was so grateful. If you've been here for a second, you know I've been on a kind of passive search for a thing that's going to fill the Mediator void in my life, because I loved the Mediator series by Mike Cabot when I was an adolescent. I read the adult installment follow-up sequel. I hated it, so I need something that gives me similar feelings, that reignites that excitement in me, that feels kind of like a ghost whisperer for teens in some ways. And this is the closest I found yet. Do I believe that we are setting up our protagonist to have a relationship with a ghost? No. But there is a cute boy that she's known from her past and has grown up in some ways that is working with her ghost hunter father, and there is potential there. And there is a kind of flirtation with the ghost here, but he moves past. And so I'm fascinated. I don't know if this is going to be a series, so I would encourage you to pick this up and read it so that it can become a series, because selfishly, I would like it to be a series, because the idea of a graphic novel series of like Ghost of the Week graphic novels, that's all I want. I mean, I didn't know I wanted it until I read this, but now I am convinced that's all I want. So I am really excited about that. This also looks at the idea of like peer pressure and trying to fit in. There's a Mean Girl-esque angle here in that our protagonist is basically punished to work the summer with her ghost hunter father after being caught at a party where there were some illicit substances. And so it is still looking at real adolescent things while also exploring ghosts and exploring the history there with the ghosts in a really interesting, compelling way. So definitely was a fan of this, absolutely loved it. And then I read Queen Bees and Wannabes by Rosalind Wiseman in preparation for the new Mean Girls movie. I did a whole video about rereading that book and just kind of what I got from it as an adult versus what I got from it when I was a teen, or what I remember getting from it when I read it as a teen. Caveat on at least one comment left on that video that I potentially didn't make clear enough in that video. I'm not a parent. I don't purport to be a parent. I don't purport to talk about parenting with any expertise or to judge parents for their parenting, but I do in that video talk about how surprised I was because I didn't remember just how much of a parenting book and how framed by being a parenting book that book was. And so I talk about it through my interpretation of that as someone who is not a parent, but I don't know that I caveated enough about that. I don't know that I mean, it's my experience, but that caveat stands. But it definitely was very interesting to revisit this. I had recalled, obviously, that Mean Girls was based on this book. I also thought for some reason that Mean Girls would have been pulling or did pull from Odd Girl Out, but having revisited this book, I can see all of the structure there. And having since been through college and being in a theater program, studying script development, being a dramaturg, I also a little bit more understand why this book lends itself so well to being the impetus or the source material for Mean Girls, because it offers the kind of bare structure and the archetypes and the stereotypes that then can be maneuvered structurally within Mean Girls. And I think we see a lot more of these references than I anticipated. However, in a shocking twist for me, we didn't see the one reference I was specifically anticipating, because I originally read Surely the first edition. I could only get the 4th edition on ebook on my phone, of all things. Phone reading is officially my least favorite way to read at this point. A decade ago, it was exciting. I could have a phone with me anywhere. However, now I really hate it. It strains my eyes, even on night mode, and I just feel cranky about it. But I persevered because that's how I could get the book. However, I could only get the 4th edition, which does not include a list of rules in Wiseman's book. She pulls like quotes from real teens. And so in the original, it talks about different rules that different friend groups across presumably the nation have. And in Mean Girls, all of these rules are condensed into the plastics. So all of those were real rules, but were like one-offs for different cliques. And so it was heightened, then the stakes were heightened dramaturgically in the movie with that. But alas, that did not make the cut for the 4th edition, or that wasn't updated for the 4th edition. But we did still have things like the map of the school that we see in Mean Girls. I don't think we see the physical map in the new musical, to my recollection, but that's something that she has students actually do, like kind of draw out the physical landscape of the different cliques. We do still see it referenced in the musical, obviously, even if we don't have the more literal map, but still. So definitely still things to be taken from the book if you aren't a parent, especially if you're a Mean Girls fan, I think, but there were also parts I struggled with a little bit more as an adult as well. So just interesting to revisit that with a new frame of reference. And then I listened to Her Good Side by Rebecca Weatherspoon, which is a YA romance, so notably much different in tone from her adult romances that I've read, like Wraith and Zenny, but this was utterly charming. We're following our protagonist, Bethany, who is a basketball star. Both of her mothers are involved in basketball, either as pro players or commentators, and she doesn't actually love basketball. And so on one hand, she's trying to kind of navigate figuring out what she wants and also how to tell her mothers that she doesn't love the thing that they love. Meanwhile, she is also trying to find a date to the homecoming dance after having been turned down by a crush and feeling very unlucky in love. Incidentally, Jacob is also feeling unlucky in love after having been dumped a couple of times pretty quickly, and despite his focus on yearbook and his TikTok following, he decides with Bethany to engage in a kind of practice relationship of sorts, especially as Bethany's friend group in particular is sensing some compatibility there, and they are not wrong. We have an excellent friend group in this book because, of course, real feelings are percolating between these two, and they have to ultimately decide if the relationship is fake after all. So this was charming, it was cute, it felt like high school, it had a fun friend group on both sides, it had a couple of protagonists who were just trying to figure things out and were so lovely, and any miscommunication felt completely rooted in the teen years, and I just really loved this one. And then we have Maud Horton's Glorious Revenge by Lizzie Pook, which I have also done a Feature Friday on, but this follows Maud, who is trying to investigate the mysterious death of her sister, who was on an Arctic expedition pretending to be a cabin boy and has died. And Maud does not believe what they are being told, especially with how little they are being told about her sister's death. And she is given a journal that her sister was keeping on this expedition, and so she and us as readers get a peek into what was going on in that timeline while Maud is trying to avenge her from a pretty notable villain in the contemporary timeline. But this villain is also a POV character in a really surprising twist for me as a reader, and honestly I think the most central POV character, because the narrative does hide some things from us as readers in an attempt to have a more shocking kind of climax in some ways, I believe, and I don't know if that is always super successful for me as a reader, especially as it forces me more into the mind of someone who I'm never supposed to question the villainy of, but I will definitely give notes for the narrative trying something, and it was exploring a really interesting kind of convergence of the science of the Arctic expedition, but also the kind of lawlessness of an expedition like that, juxtaposed against the fascination with murderers at this time and the kind of economy that built up around murderers, and our villain Edison in particular having started a business doing tours of public hangings within the confines of this narrative. I say only because based on the blurb, I thought it was a business that he had established prior to the start of the narrative, and he starts it within the narrative because a lot of his choices in this book are driven by desperation. So it's very interesting to see vengeance and desperation kind of put against each other in the same way that science and this kind of true crime obsession are put against each other, and where the commentary is in both. So there's very interesting stuff going on here, but at the same time, the narrative came at it at an angle that I didn't quite expect and didn't always feel was the most successful, but is also a really interesting point of conversation, so definitely still worth the read if this is something that sounds of interest to you. Next, I reread via audiobook My Sister the Serial Killer by Owen Ken Braithwaite. This I read the first time on audiobook as well. I think it's an excellent audiobook, especially because the chapters are very short and succinct. The whole book is very short and succinct. It does not waste time. If you're drawn to narratives with complicated protagonists, this would definitely be up your alley, because our protagonist is basically helping cover for her sister, who is, say it with me, a serial killer. And most notably, her very attractive, charismatic sister has killed former partners. And so when her sister catches the eye of a doctor our protagonist has a crush on, things start to spiral out of control. And then I read Emily Wilde's Map of the Other Limbs by Heather Fawcett, which also has a dedicated Feature Friday. And if you watch that Feature Friday, you might be like, Melody, didn't you say you read that via ebook? Which I did. However, I also had it on hold at the library already, and I was interested in what it looked like after having read it in digital, so I promise this will be returned promptly for the next reader. But I just wanted mostly to confirm that there are indeed no maps in this book that specifically mentions maps, and that maps are central to the plot in some ways, in that if the first book was about putting together the eponymous encyclopedia, this is more about the cartography of the fairy realms in a way that allows us to get to Bramblebee's realm. But there is still the kind of monster of the week-esque storyline here, in that we are going to another small remote village that has encounterings with the Fae. So this time, Emily's niece and her and Bramblebee's boss are along for the ride, and also Bramblebee has been poisoned. So if you loved the first book, I also think you're going to love this one, and if you want to dive further into this book, feel free to check out the Feature Friday for further discussion. And then I listened to Doppelganger, A Trip into the Mirror World by Naomi Klein, which chronicles her being confused with Naomi Wolf on particularly social media, and how their personas have been linked in some ways, and how that is then tying Klein to the really extreme views of Wolf. And it's incredibly personal in following Klein's obsession with this confusion and the way she kind of fixates on Wolf in some ways, and the way she's kind of lost herself and really is exploring the idea of what it means to be yourself, but then through the lens of these controversial ideas that in some ways she's kind of refuting to put the record straight on how she feels about certain things, but she's also using this as a way to look at some of these issues with a lot of nuance and open a more broad conversation in a way that I think is really skilled. So it's doing a really nice balancing act of the personal and political in this, and how the personal is political, as we've often heard. And then I also listened to Most Ardently by Gabe Kulnavoa, which is a remix of Pride and Prejudice following Oliver and his relationship with Darcy. And what I found most interesting in this, because I don't know if I've read any of these Macmillan retellings, admittedly, which is kind of shameful at this point because they've been going on for a while, and there are a lot of really interesting entries into this canon, this series, and I find the whole project really interesting. But Pride and Prejudice is kind of the easiest entry point in a lot of ways, because despite what some authors may think, we have had a decent number of Pride and Prejudice retellings, partly because they're so satisfying. And I think this struck a really nice balance, because I went in expecting a very beat for beat retelling, because this whole series is focused on the ideas of retelling through a more diverse lens. And we get that absolutely, and the beats are still there, but it also takes real ownership of the storytelling in really delightful ways, and we move past the bounds of the original story and get to see Oliver exploring things like a local bookshop and looking at some of the queer spaces that would have existed historically, but then also looking at the already high stakes of the marriage plot within these circumstances, with the idea and the gravity of what it means to be trans or queer at this time, and what a future for these characters looks like. And we do get our happily ever after that we get in the original, but also how this interpretation handles things like the choices that Charlotte has to make is really interesting. The only kind of twist, which makes sense narratively, absolutely, that got me was kind of how Wickham was handled in this, in the sense that it was always evident that Wickham was a villain in this book, and it did change some plot points later that makes that easier to buy into once we had gotten to the end, because I was like, how are we going to handle Kitty amidst all of this? But it absolutely works in context, and this was another delightful listen. And then I finally read The Queer Principles of Kit Webb by Kat Sebastian for my romance book club, and now I am ahead of the game, not only because I read this in time for book club, finished in time for book club, but then we had to move book club back. So I am a month ahead. So I'm really winning here. And I'm also winning because this was absolutely delightful. This takes place in the 1750s, so is a little bit different than the historical setting we get from a lot of historical romances. And the setting was a lot different in that we're not looking at society and ballrooms. Actually, we are very much kind of challenging that idea. We are following Kit Webb, who is a retired highwayman of sorts. He is now the owner and runner of a coffee shop, and he has been been forced into this retirement after a bad job where he has injured his leg, and his leg and that injury is central to how he has to move about the world in this book. And so we do get to see a character dealing with that, which is excellent. But his retirement is complicated by Percy, who has entered Kit's coffee shop to help steal from his father. Because after coming back from the continent, Percy has discovered that not only has his father married Percy's childhood friend and had a daughter together, he was potentially married before Percy's mother, been bigamous this whole time, and not only does that mean that Percy would be illegitimate and not set to inherit, but they are now being blackmailed over this. And so I really enjoyed how this approached the idea of Percy's title and him grappling with the inevitability of losing his title. And slight spoiler alert, that the twist and the fix at the end of this book doesn't involve Percy keeping his title, but rather the idea of what that title represents, and it grapples with the realities of what being titled and being gentry at this time would have meant, especially as Kit has a lot in his history that is complicated by his treatment from Percy's father. And so what does building a relationship look like? And so much of this relationship and the plot of this book takes place in Kit's coffee shop, which is fabulous because it's a setting that I personally haven't read about a whole lot, and there is a lot of charm and humor. It definitely, while I have talked a lot about this book in reference to the cover and it being a change from Sebastian's previous work and feeling much more rom-com-y, I do think the tone of this book is trying to lean into the rom-com of it a little bit more, or in a different way than some of her previous work as well. We also have this idea of the community in the coffee shop I really like, and not just the spider, but the idea of the little lending library Kit has and Percy's infatuation with the book Tom Jones, which I have read when I was in college over the summer, and I could not tell you probably anything about that book, which was very long. So now I'm like, do I too need to read Tom Jones? I probably won't get to it, let's be real. But this was an utter delight. I want to say surprise because there were new things in here to discover and things that I as a romance reader haven't encountered as much or at all. But at the same time, it wasn't a surprise because I trust Sebastian as a writer and I'm very interested in where she is taking us as readers. So very excited, especially because I already own the sequel, so I can dive in at my earliest convenience. Then finally for the month, I also listened to Love on the Brain by Ali Hazelwood, which is the Hazelwood I needed to swing back to complete at least her adult books. And I think I've discovered audio is my sweet spot for Hazelwood, which I read The Love Hypothesis and loved that reading experience. And I didn't love the audio experience of the novellas, but these last two novels I really enjoyed listening to. And spoiler alert, sneak peek to get you coming back for the February wrap up, I also really enjoyed listening to Bride. So this was the second in the Love Hypothesis trilogy of sorts, this time with NASA. We of course had a miscommunication. We had a heroine who thought the hero hated her because he's bad at communicating. We had almost comical levels of obliviousness. We had a third act with a villain appearing out of the ether. Well, not out of the ether, but a surprising outside villain that wasn't so surprising. We of course had a very small heroine and a very large hero, and while I have gone on ad nauseum about that dynamic, I do think it was reined in a little bit in this book in that it wasn't dwelled on in a really distracting way, or I've just become immune to it. And I'm not gonna lie, the comical levels of miscommunication in this were more frustrating at times, particularly in this book, but at the same time, Hazelwood's voice is just so fun, things move so fast, I am able to go along for the ride, and I really like the settings of these books. I think I narrowed it down a little bit when talking with a friend via text about Hazelwood, in that we have these really smart but really dumb heroines, right? They are very smart, but their social and emotional intelligence isn't the best. And you know what? I can respect it. I am also not always very smart on the social and emotional intelligence, I'm sure. So we kind of have to suspend our disbelief at times in terms of the miscommunication. And I know I'm becoming a boring adult because the job side of things is just as interesting as anything to me in this. I enjoy the fight over funding and whether someone has returned your emails and the fact that you're on a short contract and do you have such and such a badge to get into the perks of the place of business. So yeah, still had a good time. I would definitely say the Love Hypothesis is still my favorite of these three, but it is definitely following a formula for people still chasing that high. Some people love it because that's what they're in for. Some people may not because it feels like we're just doing the same song and dance over and over again. I guess let me know where you fall. And with that, that is January. So let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them, or just let me know how your January reading went, what you read that you loved, if there was anything you read that you want to warn people away from, how you feel the start of your reading year is going, and what your goals are for the rest of the year as well. If you have the thought, leave it below. But as always, thank you so much for hanging out and being interested in my thoughts. I truly appreciate it. Go ahead and like and subscribe if you feel like it. But as always, most importantly, read something good. And yeah, bye.